Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to part 3 of a how-to guide for developing a publishable scholarship of teaching and learning project. My name is Valerie O'Loughlin. I am past president of HAPS, and as I mentioned in the previous videos, these videos are as part of my HAPS President's Initiative, Expanding Anatomy and Physiology Education Research in HAPS. I'd like to thank the HAPS President Initiative sponsors, McGraw-Hill and Wiley, for helping fund this project. So today I'll be talking about part 3, determining appropriate methods of assessment for your educational research project. Classroom research can utilize multiple forms of assessment. Many of us may be looking at just a single type, but I want you to be familiar with all the different forms of assessment. So for example, many of us may be more familiar with quantitative forms of assessment, such as looking at means on an exam and comparing means across semesters, but also be aware that there are qualitative forms of assessment that you can do in your educational research project. In addition, there are both formative and/or summative forms of assessment, and I'll be discussing both of these in the next few slides. So let's compare formative versus summative assessments. Formative assessments are done during a learning unit or during a specific segmented learning program, not at the end of a semester or at the end of a unit. These can be fairly informal. You could do clicker questions. They can be asking students to get together in groups and write out the responses, and then you collect feedback at the end. So it doesn't have to be a formalized quiz or exam. And formative assessments are designed to provide immediate feedback to the students so that they can gauge what do they know, what don't they know, and how can they adjust their learning so that when it comes time for the summative assessment, they have a good handle on what they've learned. Formative assessments are designed to improve the quality of teaching and learning during a unit, as opposed to summative assessments which typically are done at the end of a unit. And some examples of formative assessments can be some of those classroom assessment techniques that I talked about during part 2, homework exercises that are graded and returned. If you have students participate in a discussion and they have to write written responses, those can be types of formative assessments. Any form of writing, journal entries, and perhaps you may have them do a pre-test. Summative assessments may be the type of assessments that most of us are familiar with. These are performed at the end of a program or unit, and typically they are designed to check the learning at the end of a unit as opposed to during the unit itself. Examples of summative assessments may be the unit exams, lecture exams, or lab exams, a written paper at the end of a course, lab write-ups after the lab is complete, or perhaps if you have them do a journal and then you don't assess the journal until the very end of the course. So what I have here is an example of a formative assessment. I used some of the D'Angelo and Cross's classroom assessment techniques, and I took one of their classroom assessment techniques called the memory matrix, and I modified these for my Anatomy A215 course. So on our website, and you can access any of these through this URL listed below, I have a variety of formative assessments that we do in the class. So even though the class has about 400 students, I will break up lecture and have them get together in groups. They will have already brought these memory matrices with them to class, and I'll have them fill out these memory matrices with their notes closed to say, what do you know, what don't you know? So this can help them gauge their learning. Then we go over this as a group in class, and we can discuss some of their learning misconceptions prior to the exam. I wrote up the information about how these memory matrices improved the quality of learning and improved the number of students who were improving on summative assessments in this article in Journal on Excellence in College Teaching listed below. So if any of you want to access these memory matrices, you're more than welcome to access them. You can go to my website here for this course and simply click on the Learning Exercises link, and then you can click on the words listed as Exam 1, 2, 3, 4 to access the various memory matrices. So let's compare quantitative and qualitative forms of assessments. Most of us are familiar with quantitative assessments. These are things that may have an actual grade or number associated with them, so then we can compare means across semesters or across exams. So examples of quantitative assessments that you can look at is you can look at exam scores or homework scores. You could take a look at web usage data. So let's say you were doing a flipped classroom and you want to see, are students accessing the flipped classroom video material prior to class? Well, if you have this on a website that collects web usage data, you can take a look at the web usage data for those days prior to that day's class and then determine how many students or how many people are hitting that site and use that as a measure of assessment to say, yes, individuals are accessing this site. Another form of quantitative assessment is class demographics. If you want to look at prior GPA of students, and we'll talk about this during the video 4 when we talk about human subjects approval, but if you get approval to look at prior GPA, you can see whether students with higher GPAs may do better in your anatomy class, or does it not make a difference? Does the type of major make a difference in your class? Is it that pre-nursing students tend to perform better than other pre-allied health students? So these are types of quantitative assessments you can use. You may also want to look at the percentage of students participating in an assignment. So for example, I told you about the memory matrices that I use in my Anatomy 8-15 class. I did a very informal quantitative measure, but I would go around the room, walk around the room, see what students were actively engaged in the assessment versus students who were passively looking on and not doing the material, because an assessment is only as valid as the number of students who are participating in the assignment. Finally, your grades in the course can be used as a type of quantitative assessment, either exam grades, homework grades, final grades for the course. You can take a look at whether those grades have changed after you've done a particular teaching intervention. Some of us may not be as familiar with the qualitative forms of assessment that you can do in your class. So let me give you some examples of some of these qualitative assessments. Let's say you do a teaching intervention like a flipped class, and you want to know what are the students' perceptions of the flipped classroom, how they feel this impacted their learning. Prepare a survey and ask your students to fill out the survey, and then look at the comments and then group them according to common themes. If you haven't done a particular teaching intervention but just want to see what are some areas that seem to be good and that you can improve upon, take a look at the comments on your teacher evaluations. These are anonymous comments and you can group them accordingly based on various codes or themes. Do they find you approachable? Did they feel that particular activities that you did in classroom were especially useful for their learning? If you do some form of writing, let's say you do lab write-ups at the end of each lab, did the complexity of their writing increase? Did they seem to understand the various anatomy and physiology concepts a bit better? And were the lab write-ups more professional at the end of class than at the beginning of class? That could indicate that what you were doing in the classroom is helping them with the learning and developing their writing competency skills. If you have students generate questions for the exam and have them do this as an activity, you could analyze that as well as any of their discussion responses in the classes, and again, look for common themes. If you do student journal entries, I have a 400 level anatomy class where I have the students write a reflective journal entry at the end of each activity that we do. We have 10 activities that they are supposed to do, and I have them reflect on their anatomy knowledge and their prediction of the knowledge of the material we have yet to cover and how they think their learning has progressed. I've then looked at those journal entries and developed some qualitative assessments of students' perception of learning in that classroom. Finally, you can interview or do focus groups with students, the TAs, or other instructors in the class if you've done a particular teaching intervention. Collect that interview data and then qualitatively analyze it for various themes. So here are a couple of examples of either medical education or anatomy and physiology education articles that use multiple forms of assessment. The first of these is in Advances in Physiology Education. They used a tool referred to as this intrinsic motivation tool. So they looked at students' intrinsic motivation and whether or not that equated to higher levels of class performance. And they found that there was a gender-related difference, that for males, if they had a higher intrinsic motivation to learn the material, they tended to do better. Whereas for females, the intrinsic motivation did not matter as much. They tended to perform equally regardless of their motivation. Another article in Medical Education, this is an online journal that looked at personality preference influences with computer-aided instruction. and then this virtual microscopy study that looked at both quantitative and qualitative changes in teaching histology. In this particular study, they looked at improvement of lab exam scores when virtual microscopy was introduced to the lab versus optical microscopy. And then there was a qualitative component where the students were surveyed about their perceptions of the virtual microscopy. So there, both quantitative and qualitative forms of assessment were used in this educational research study. Now, whenever you look at an assessment, you want to make sure that a good assessment is both reliable and valid. And in statistics, what exactly does reliability and validity mean? The two terms are related, but they have specific different definitions that you should be aware of. The definition for reliability is the extent to which a measurement or experiment yields the same results on repeated trials. So a quick and easy way to remember this is that reliability refers to repeatability. If you do the same experiment over and over again, will you get the same or similar results? So for example, if you have a reliable multiple choice exam, that will tend to give similar ranges or means for that multiple choice exam score, regardless of the semester that you give the exam, and if you have somewhat similar exam groups but some slight differences between the groups. Validity, in contrast, refers to which the degree of a study accurately reflects or assesses a concept that you're trying to measure. So with validity, you are looking at whether or not the assessment is true or accurate explanation of a particular event. And with validity, you usually have to use multiple assessment methods to try to determine whether an assessment measure is valid. So reliability and validity are interrelated, but they do have specific differences associated with them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about assessments that may have reliability or not validity or vice versa. So you want to be aware of assessments that may be reliable but not valid. So a reliable assessment, you may run a statistical test on it and it says, based on the statistical test, it has a high reliability, but it may not provide a valid assessment of what you're trying to learn. So an analogy that we can all relate to is your bathroom scale. It may be reliable, but not valid. Let's say your bathroom scale consistently measures 10 pounds less than your actual weight. It is repeatedly measuring 10 pounds less, so it is a reliable measure, but it's not valid because you happen to weigh 10 pounds more than what the scale actually says. In education research, an example I can give you is that if you wanted to assess students' critical thinking skills, if you tried to do that using a multiple choice exam and looked at multiple choice exam scores. The multiple choice exam may give you repeated, reliable results. But is looking at multiple choice exam scores really a valid measure of assessing critical thinking skills in your students? Definitely not. So that's an example of a reliable tool that would not be valid if you're trying to look at critical thinking skills. Sometimes assessments can be valid but not necessarily reliable. So they may accurately measure what you're trying to do, but you can't get that repeatability that you want to try to get. So the assessment produces an accurate result, but you can't reproduce the results, or there isn't enough information for the reader, should you publish it, that they can reproduce the result. So if you don't properly describe your research methods and people try to reproduce your study and they can't do it, then your assessment is considered valid but not necessarily reliable because you haven't thoroughly described the research methods. Obviously, we don't want to have assessments that are neither reliable nor valid. So an example of that would be if you take a look at the supermarket tabloids and where they're taking a look at some celebrity, female celebrity, looking at her belly, seeing a little bit of a belly pooch and saying she must be pregnant because we see a little bit of a bulge in her belly. That assessment is neither reliable nor valid. It's used all the time, but it's neither reliable nor valid. So to summarize, whatever assessments you decide to use for your educational research study, make sure that they are both reliable and valid. And if you're not sure about how to assess validity, I recommend contacting your statistical consulting center if you have one on your campus, or talk to your school of education, or talk to your statistics department on campus, and they can provide you with some ways of assessing the validity. You also want to utilize multiple methods of assessment to help answer your research questions. So just don't rely on a single assessment method like a final exam score. See if you can look at both formative and summative assessments in your class, and can you take a look at both quantitative and qualitative research methods. And keep in mind that when you perform your research, you will need to describe to the reader or to the audience, should you be presenting your research, about whether the assessments were reliable and valid, how you determined they were reliable and valid, and whether or not they adequately support the hypotheses presented. So now it's your turn. As I'm ending this session, think about your own classes. Think about some of the methods of assessment you may have used in your own classes: exams, lab write-ups. If you do a problem-based learning activity, a PBL, do you save the write-up for those classes? Or do you have a TBL, team-based learning activity, journal entries? Are there assessments that you've used consistently over the years? And perhaps you can use past years' data to be used as a control group if you want to do a teaching intervention for this upcoming semester. Or maybe you're looking at the assessments you have now and you're saying, you know what, they may not be adequate measures of assessment, but start thinking now, what are some new measures of assessment you can use in your classroom to answer some of your educational research questions? So coming up in the next video, we'll talk a little bit about a process called IRB approval. IRB stands for Institutional Review Board, or Human Subjects. We'll talk about performing your research and how to collect your data, and then a little bit of a primer about analyzing your data. So see you next time.